So, Steve, I'll ask you about two particular quarterback situations because they're both stable but brand new at the same time at Alabama and Ohio State. So, J.T. Barrett, much maligned for as successful as he was, basically limited and didn't develop and grow as many people had anticipated. But still, you knew most Saturdays what you were going to get from J.T. Barrett. Now they unveiled Dwayne Haskins, who's most likely going to win the job, who has a very limited track record, but that track record was pretty impressive, namely against Michigan. And then at Alabama, we've got Tua Tangavailoa, who comes in and does what he does, but still the track record is very minimal. But do you look at recruiting ranking with Tua, plus what we more importantly saw against the Georgia Bulldogs with the heat on, and say, check mark, the quarterback position's in great shape, and what's your evaluation at Ohio State as well?
Those are interesting circumstances because do you give credit? Do I give a bonus point? And that's something I'll have to weigh because we saw very limited meaningful action from Dwayne Haskins and from Tua Tangavailoa. I'm going to learn to say it, I promise. Tangavailoa.
I'm working on that myself.
I'm working on it too. Anyway, I'm just going with Tua right now. I can get Tua down. I'm going with that. But the meaningful action we saw, I mean, Dwayne Haskins probably won Ohio State the Big Ten championship with that third and forever throw at the Big House. And then you add in, what Tua did coming off the bench in legendary status on the biggest stage in the sport possible. So is that enough to give them the benefit of the doubt? That's a good question I'm going to wrestle with during the offseason because I do think it is different. Coming in that situation, especially when it's a sudden change and you've not had the pressure. I mean, in the case of Dwayne Haskins, he didn't have the pressure all week long of the rivalry and knowing he was going to go into that environment and have to start on the road. He didn't have to face that. Essentially, it was a bang-bang play. J.T. Barrett, had a knee injury that originally got tweaked in the pregame and then it got aggravated in the game. And, hey, kid, you're in. Okay? And then the first three plays he's in, you'll recall, were false starts. Okay? So, and then just throw it down there and put it in the tightest window possible, and it worked. Mm-hmm. For Tua, they walk into halftime on a 10-minute notice and said, hey, kid, you're in, after you hadn't played any meaningful football the entire season. So I think it's a lot different. And I don't know the Haskins kid as well as what we've seen from Tua, who was probably the most high-profile backup quarterback in college football this year because he was so dominant during Alabama's spring football a year ago, and he was so highly celebrated. So we kind of got to look at how he handles his business. We don't really know, I think, some of those answers where Dwayne Haskins is concerned. But, and Tua doesn't even know who his offensive coordinator is right now, Mark. They don't know what kind of offensive system they're going to run. Okay, so and we don't know if Jalen Hurts will stay. I doubt he will because I think that matters in terms of how much they run him. If you got Jalen Hurts sitting there on the back, and you got your backup who is SEC Player of the Year in 2016, you might run Tua in the quarterback RPO game a lot more than you would if it's a true freshman sitting there that you don't know much more about, right? On the other hand, Dwayne Haskins is a five-star kid. Tate Martell backing him up. They might feel free to run him like a Braxton Miller more often. Who knows? These are things that I think we have to go through more of the spring and the off season and look for little signs. And I'll give your audience one example. 2 years ago, I was really high on LSU the entire offseason because of how many guys they had coming back. But they, of course, had the big question with I'm trying to remember the young man at quarterback who was
Brandon Harris.
That ended up Brandon Harris transferred to North Carolina, right? Okay. And so right up all summer long, right up until I was about to unveil my preseason projection of the season, I'm mowing my lawn and I'm listening to SiriusXM's coverage of the SEC Media Days in Alabama. And the only team in the SEC that returned the starting quarterback that didn't bring him to represent the school at SEC Media Days, guess who it was? LSU and Brandon Harris. And as soon as I saw that, after I got done mowing my lawn, I quickly ran in the house before I published my preview and totally changed how I projected LSU's season from a preseason top 5 team to more of a top 15 team. Why? Because you don't do that at that position. If that's your leader, if that's the guy who spent the offseason truly stepping up and asserting himself and improving himself and taken the next step in his development, you want to show him off, right? If he's not showing up, that tells me you don't want him answering questions. You're not really sure about him quite yet. He hasn't taken that step. And so I think those are the things we as fans got to look for when it comes to guys like Dwayne Haskins and Tua, who in limited action have shown their 5-star recruit status has some legitimacy, but it is different being the guy that is now the head of the program than the guy that gets called in relief. I think that's why a guy like Urban Meyer stood so closely by JT Barrett these last 4 years, despite his obvious deficiencies at times, is the known coaches love certainty, as you well know. You knew what you were going to get out of JT. And if you're a coach, especially if you're a great coach like Urban Meyer, you have the instilled arrogance to believe, I can compensate for his weaknesses if I just know what they are. As a Michigan fan, this is what killed our team more than anything else. We started 14 different offensive line combinations this year, Mark, 14. We started 3 different quarterbacks. You know what that means? That's uncertainty, Mark. That means even a coach as meticulous as Jim Harbaugh, who will run 35 sets in one half of football, when he doesn't know what his offensive line is or who the starting quarterback is on a game-to-game, quarter-to-quarter basis, you don't have that certainty. You don't, and even the best of coaches are like, how do I game plan around that? We saw this with Alabama against Auburn. When they had the bulk of injuries, it wasn't how many injuries Alabama had. I mean, if Alabama had an injury at running back and an injury at tight end and an injury receiver, they recruit so well they could withstand that. It was the cluster of injuries at one position, the linebacker spot. And now they're playing in true freshmen that either they were only going to make gunners on special teams or red shirts this year. You can't game plan not even Nick Saban can game plan around the fact that this linebacker is seeing window dressing from a Gus Malzahn offense for the first time in his life, because 6 months ago he was in high school. You can't game plan around that. And that's the one thing with when fans get excited about the more recruited younger player taking over. That's, if you wonder why, when you see him in limited duty, you see a level of explosiveness you didn't see from the incumbent. And you wonder, why didn't the coach then play him? This is why. Coaches want certainty. And they think, if I know what your weaknesses are, I can scheme and game plan around them. But if I don't know game to game, play to play, what you're going to bring to the table, that gets really frustrating even for the greatest of coaches.